Masculinity is an interesting topic nowadays. Over the last couple centuries, we have put masculinity into this box of being the default, the standard to live by which defines normal. Anything that doesn't meet up to it, especially if it involves men, being considered strange and alien. Which has put us in an interesting position, because while we are assuming masculinity is the default, we haven't really examined it, explored what it means to be a man, and this has led to a generation of men feeling lost. Being a man now means either falling into a play of being a bunch of obsolete stereotypes or being absolutely nothing, meaning an entire generation of men now have a core part of their identity that is completely meaningless unless they put on some sort of inauthentic show. And this has led to men who don't want to play pretend, searching for meaning, looking in all sorts of places, in faith, in con artists, in ideologies, or even in the media we consume. A while ago, I stumbled across the live-action Yu Yu Hakusho on Netflix and found I was greeted with a really unique opportunity. You see, I had never seen the anime before, despite being told for years to watch it, and thought, hey, it could be a pretty cool opportunity to see what I thought of it without any prior expectations. So I went in expecting to see, at best, another live-action One Piece, and at worst, a good laugh. And let me tell you, I was blown away. Little did I know there was an all-star lineup behind the scenes on this one. Amazing shot composition from Shin Godzilla's Kosuke Yamada, a soul-lifting soundtrack from Yutaka Yamada of Vinland Saga, and god-tier fight direction from Oichi Takehito of the amazing Rurouni Kenshin movies. Even if this isn't the most faithful adaptation, is it any wonder that I had an absolute blast watching it? But beyond being visual and audible bliss, I started to notice something. This silly supernatural martial arts show made me feel things. Even in the live action, there is this awesome parallel between Yusuke and the antagonist Togoro that, to me, seemed to represent the two approaches to dealing with masculinity. And I will get to that. And that's where I had a realization. If this is what a crammed, poorly paced adaptation of this story could get me feeling, then what does the version it was adapted from look like? And this sent me on an amazing journey, because while I saw amazing fight scenes, good voice delivery, cool characters, there is something that stands front and center that makes this show great. I saw the beautiful masculinity of Yu Yu Hakusho. Hegemonic masculinity is a term that refers to what we have considered typical masculinity in the last century or so. It refers to the often anxiety-inducing charade that men have to perform. A lot of what some would consider toxic masculinity today falls under and arguably comes from the idea of hegemonic masculinity. If you would like more information on hegemonic masculinity, FD Signify has an awesome couple videos on the manosphere where he goes into more detail. Also, you should just check those videos out anyway, as they are very enlightening, a smooth watch, and unlike me, he actually has the balls to sit in front of a camera, probably in big part due to how handsome he is. But essentially, it's what you think when you refer to the typical idea of being a man. And if you see a few clips of Yu Yu Hakusho, it certainly seems like it's lending itself to that idea, what with its stoic, muscular men and intense fight scenes.
I've got the balls. Let's do this with a knife-edge deathmatch. A knife-edge deathmatch?
Did he say knife-edge deathmatch?
A knife-edge deathmatch, huh?
What is that, per se?
But after watching only a couple of episodes, you'll see that it's actually quite the opposite. These boys support each other, they're open about how they feel, and they don't subscribe to typical masculine performance, at least not entirely. One of the main cast, Kurama, is a great example of this. He likes flowers, he is empathetic, he is typically soft, and he is pretty to the point of, in one occasion, being mistaken for a woman, and it's not even seen as a bad thing. Instead, the reaction is just...
I'm sorry about that, man. Don't be.
In spite of being from a show in the mid-90s, and in spite of Kurama's presenting softness and femininity, he is still routinely shown to be one of the most capable and hardcore members of the main cast, and I really like that. Speaking of femininity, the show doesn't portray that as a bad thing either. There is a notable female cast in this shonen, and while the show isn't necessarily about them, they are all memorable and noteworthy in their own unique way. Genkai, the master and the mentor of the group, being the most focused on, but my favourite being Kuwabara's sister Shizuru, and everything I need to tell you about why I love this character is in this scene.
Go on to your filthy home. This here tournament for apparitions only.
You can't scare me with that talk. I know Yusuke's beaten creatures a lot bigger than you.
Your boy's asleep. Too bad you can't protect yourself.
Thanks a lot. So I see where Kuwabara got the need to defend himself growing up. Yeah.
Lucky bastard. But everything I've shown you here is just some of the smaller ways this show challenges typical gender archetypes and masculinity. Learning to wear a mask is the first lesson in patriarchal masculinity that a boy learns. He learns that his core feelings cannot be expressed if they do not conform to the acceptable behaviours sexism defines as male. Asked to give up the true self in order to realise the patriarchal ideal, boys learn self-betrayal early and are rewarded for these acts of soul murder. Bell Hooks, The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity and Love. There is a clear parallel set up between the show's main character Yusuke and the antagonist Togoro. See, in both versions of this story, Yusuke dies in the first episode and is brought to the afterlife where he initially declines the chance to be brought back to life because he genuinely believes that no one will miss him. In the anime, he even looks happy about this, declaring that now his mum won't have to worry about him anymore and teachers won't have to stress over him. He genuinely can't fathom that anyone would miss him, let alone love him, and it's such a seemingly obvious fact to Yusuke that it genuinely doesn't bother him. However, after seeing his own funeral, seeing his loved ones crying over him, seeing his head teacher feels that he failed him, seeing his best friend Kuwabara shed tears over him, it forces Yusuke to do something that, hell, even I struggled to do until very recently in my life. Something that most people, but especially boys and men, find difficult. Yusuke chooses, in his own way, to accept that people love him. Meanwhile, Togoro, spoilers for the entire series by the way, preaches the opposite. Togoro believes that in order to become strong, that in order to become a man, you must throw away your personal attachment and become an entity that can only focus on self-betterment. A literal demon. In other words, in order to become strong, Togoro kills his soul. After seeing a glimmer of potential in Yusuke, Togoro decides to terrify him. He threatens him and everyone he loves by displaying his own strength and in turn highlighting Yusuke's weakness, forcing Yusuke, a 14-year-old schoolboy, to confront a real terror. And sure, most shonen protagonists are young and all of them go through shit. That is demanding to say the least. But being a young boy and having an older man, one that you might even look up to in some way, threaten violence on you is a very specific, very real fear that a lot of young boys have to face, and of those boys, many respond the same way Yusuke initially does. To get stronger, to emulate the thing that scares them. And this is Togoro's first step in trying to make Yusuke pretty much like him for the sake of his own self-betterment. To indoctrinate boys into the rules of patriarchy, we must force them to feel pain and to deny their feelings. Yeah, I'm gonna keep using quotes from this book, but there's a lot of bangers in there and it's a great book, and if you don't like it, you can physically fight me. But Yusuke has something that Togoro just doesn't. He has a support system. He has people that believe in him, people that love him, something that Togoro once lost and never allowed himself to feel or find again, priding himself on throwing it away. When Yusuke is finally pushed to achieve his full potential, his power-up isn't a typical anime shonen one. It's not based on rage, but depression and responsibility. To acknowledge that strength doesn't come from isolation. You will never get better alone. The whole point of strength is to protect and uplift those that don't have it. Yusuke, once again, chooses to accept that people love him and that he loves them too. They're the reason he fights.
Since I started this whole tournament, I've learned the value of what you gave away. And I won't let it go, even if I have to give up my life!
Yusuke even admits that Togoro's strength is tantalizing in its own way. He seemingly does what he wants when he wants, and no one can tell him what to do. But much like most displays of hegemonic masculinity, this is a performance. After his death at the end of Season 2, Togoro is judged in the afterlife, and his sentence is fairly lenient, but Togoro himself objects to this. He chooses the worst kind of hell available for himself. And even more shocking, the love of his life, Genkai, meets him at the gates to confront him one final time, to tell him that he doesn't have to do this, he doesn't have to be alone, dying won't heal him. And all Togoro, the immovable monster, the man who threw his soul away, all he can say is... Even at the end, even as someone he loves is screaming at him, Togoro can't see himself as anything more than a burden. He can't accept that people love him. He could probably never even fathom why. After this scene, I look at Togoro and I don't see an unstoppable demon who has dedicated his long life to strength. I see a lonely man who wanted to be so strong that he was no longer a burden to anyone. And I love Togoro. I think he's one of the coolest villains in Shonen, but looking at him that way, I can't help but see something beautifully tragic. But I've talked about the different ways that this show has picked apart the different ways of approaching masculinity and engaging with it, and that's really cool, but how about I get to the beautiful part? And that comes in the form of my favourite character. That comes in the form of...
A mulberry is a tree, Kuwabara is a man, and I'll prove it.
Kuwabara is easily my favourite character in this show. He has an obsession with being able to convey the masculine performance, but he is in no way a typical man. Yes, Kuwabara is tough, he is loud, and he is prideful, but there is one thing about Kuwabara, something that is at the core of his character that makes him, in my opinion, the most likeable character in the show. Kuwabara is empathetic, to the point where it is a literal superpower. The second episode of the show is about Kuwabara throwing away his pride, tough guy persona, and even his personal well-being for his friends. But my favourite demonstration of Kuwabara's empathy comes in Season 3. For context, the group of villains at the beginning of this arc are mostly normal people who have been subject to something called the Black Tape, a videotape of infinite length containing the worst acts of humanity that's being used to indoctrinate young men and boys into a nihilistic way of thinking in order to enlist them to an evil cause. So, think Twitter on VHS. Kuwabara encounters one such boy, a young boy who, on behalf of his group, targets Kuwabara and his friends, seriously injuring them and suffocating them to the point of unconsciousness. But after Kuwabara beats him by cutting dimensions, go watch the show, Kuwabara not only shows mercy, but carries him and all of his friends back to safety, once again in spite of his own physical health. This has such an effect that when the boy tries to justify his beliefs with the horror of what the Black Tape shows him, Yusuke uses Kuwabara, his kindness and his empathy to counter that point, Let me point out again, Kuwabara is literally used as a counter to nihilism. The kid mentions atrocities and Yusuke turns around and goes, yeah, okay, fair point, but have you considered the fact that Kuwabara exists? And I think there is something truly amazing about Kuwabara, the character obsessed with being a man the most, the one who you could argue would hold himself to hegemonic standards of performative masculinity the most, is so empathetic, is so kind, that he is the narrative's direct counter to the concept of nihilism. Hey, post-editing Tom here. I'm in a new place, so sorry if it sounds like arse. I haven't really set up the microphone in a good place yet. I just wanted to say that I took to Reddit and asked the Yu Yu Hakusho Reddit, what they think about this show and masculinity, and a lot of people said that Kuwabara represents positive masculinity, and I remember one comment says anything Kuwabara says or does, and I just think that's really funny. I also just wanted to do a quick shout out to the people of that Reddit. You guys have been lovely. You've been instrumental in helping me locate certain episodes for B-roll and stuff really quickly. And yeah, that's awesome. So if any of you guys are watching, thank you so much. You've been absolutely brilliant. And I also just want to remind you, the viewer, that hey, if you made it this far into the video, you should probably shoot me a like and maybe subscribe. Maybe you'll like some of my latest stuff. Anyway, back to the video. I will pass you back to professional, edited, better Tom now, who has a script and stuff. Okay, bye. Boys are complicated. Served by patriarchal society only slightly less than we are broken by it, taught that running away from our emotions is somehow controlling them, as if you could ever tame something you don't even interact with, along with a lot of other bullshit that we're all trying to figure out but no one seems to fully understand yet. If my complicated journey with masculinity has taught me anything, it's that being a man is only part of your identity. It can be a good part, it can be a bad part, but it's only a part, and it's down to us to decide how that part interacts with the rest of us. And we cannot fall into the trap of using that part to smother the rest of ourselves. You can be a cool masculine Superman and also be a kind and goofy individual. You can be a feminine beautiful boy and also be a competent stoic master of emotion. You can be a macho man's man and also have a massive sense of empathy that borders on supernatural. It's not the fact that you're a man that defines your character. It's the kind of man you decide to be. Years ago, a friend of mine told me to watch this show because the main character Yusuke was, and I quote, like me. And I didn't know it then, but that's probably one of the reasons why it took me so long to get to this show, because surprisingly, as a teenager, I didn't like myself very much. Please, contain your shock. And when I watched this show over a decade later, and I saw that in the first episode, Yusuke was also not very fond of himself, that he also thought the lives of his peers would be better off without him, that the first arc of the show is actually kind of about addressing that exact feeling I had, I can't help but wonder, what effect would this have had on the boy I was? Would I have chosen to listen to this show's message to accept that people love me? Or would I have simply continued to convince myself that I'm not worthy of love? The easy option. And wondering that question is what made me want to make this video. I think a lot of young boys and men need to see this story. I think it could play an essential part in detangling some of the bullshit around masculinity today. To see badass male characters who can be emotional, who can be feminine, who can be empathetic, who can acknowledge love. What the world needs now is liberated men. Men who are empathetic and strong, autonomous and connected, responsible to self, to family and friends, to society, and capable of understanding how those responsibilities are ultimately inseparable. Men need feminist thinking. It is the theory that supports their spiritual evolution and their shift away from the patriarchal model. Patriarchy is destroying the well-being of men, taking their lives daily. There is more to masculinity than just being a wall. We know masculinity can be strong. We know it can be dominant. We even know it can be comforting. But after watching this show, I got a reminder of a side of masculinity that I haven't seen since Lord of the Rings. That if we men help each other, if we listen to others and we decide to hold all of ourselves to a higher standard, masculinity can be beautiful.